They called him Bone Breaker. Once. Now? Just another relic, limping into the sense for one last fight. Ryan Cavano had seen galaxies burn. But even legends fade. His spine bent. His blade dulled. His enemies forgotten. But his pride? Still intact. The crowd mocked him. Roared with laughter. Pathetic. He can barely stand. They weren't wrong. But Ryan didn't come here to impress them. He came here to eat. To survive. And then, she appeared. Remma Archiner. Eldest of the warrior sisters. A name whispered in fear and desire across star systems. Emerald skin that shimmered like armor. Eyes like blue lightning. He'd faced void horrors, warlords, and titans. But nothing prepared him for the way she looked at him. Then it happened. He stumbled. His leg caught on uneven sand. His body tipped forward. And his hand, his ruined, battle-worn hand, landed on her shoulder. Her exposed clavicle. Smooth. Cool. Sacred. The crowd froze. The guards raised their weapons. Remma did not flinch. "You are either the bravest man alive," she said, voice calm as steel, "or the most foolish." Ryan withdrew his hand. "I've been called both. Usually within the same conversation." She stared at him for a long moment. Then spoke again, this time for all to hear. "You have made a formal claim. The first by a man in 17 cycles." Ryan blinked. "A claim, to what?" "To me. Or more precisely, to a night of trial. With me and my sisters." Silence fell across the arena. "Her sisters think you're too weak for us." Perhaps they are right. But now, you will prove them wrong. Or die trying. The air in the arena trembled, as though the very fabric of reality had shifted. The crowd, once roaring, now fell into an almost reverent silence. There was a palpable tension in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm, as all eyes turned to the judge's platform. Then, she appeared. Remma Archiner, the eldest of the Archiner sisters, stepped into the arena with an elegance that seemed to bend time itself. Her emerald skin, radiant in the harsh twin suns of Zantara 7, shimmered like the surface of an alien sea, glowing faintly as if she carried the pulse of 1,000 forgotten stars within her. Each step she took was a dance of grace, her ceremonial armor clinging to her form with an effortless beauty that belied its functional strength. It was more than just protection, it was a symbol of power, of ancient legacies, and of something otherworldly. The crowd held its collective breath as she moved, her presence almost otherworldly. The air around her seemed to ripple, as if the universe itself acknowledged her importance. Every movement she made spoke of control, of mastery over herself and those who dared to face her. Ryan's heart stuttered in his chest, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to slow. His eyes locked with hers, a gaze as sharp and predatory as the finest blade, electric blue against the deep green of her complexion. Her eyes seemed to cut through him, as if she could see all his brokenness, his pain, his past failures. In that moment, he was no longer a warrior in an arena, he was a man, vulnerable and exposed. He straightened, trying to regain some semblance of dignity, but the weight of his years and the toll of battle hung heavy on his shoulders. His attempt at a bow was far from graceful, it resembled the awkward stumble of a man who had forgotten how to stand tall. His foot caught on an unseen ridge in the sand. His balance faltered, and before he could stop himself, his hand shot out, instinct, not choice. It landed on Remma's exposed shoulder. The crowd gasped, the sound a collective intake of breath. The tension in the air thickened, a storm brewing in the hearts of the spectators. "My apologies, Lady Archiner," Ryan murmured, his voice hoarse with embarrassment, his weathered features flushed in the harsh light of the twin suns. The guards surrounding Remma tensed immediately, their weapons half raised, eyes locked on Ryan. The delicate balance of power shifted. Remma's eyes, initially wide in surprise, narrowed slowly into slits. A calculated calm descended over her like a shadow. She was not angry, no, this was something more intricate, more dangerous. You are either the bravest man alive, she said, her voice smooth, like honey poured over steel, cutting through the silence with a dangerous edge, or the most foolish. Ryan felt his heart skip a beat. There was a challenge in her voice, a cold promise of something far deeper than mere words. He stood taller, but his legs were heavy with the weight of his past mistakes, the shadow of his former strength looming behind him. I've been called both, Ryan said, trying to reclaim his confidence, his smirk returning with practiced ease. Usually by the same person, within minutes of each other. A small, fleeting smile tugged at the corner of Remma's lips, barely perceptible, like the first hint of dawn before the sun fully rises. It was a smile that was not just amused, but calculating. She was measuring him, weighing him like a prize fighter sizing up his opponent. Do you know what you've just done, bone breaker? She asked, her tone now cool and inviting, as though the question held far more meaning than it seemed on the surface. Ryan couldn't resist. The words left his lips before his mind could process the risk. Embarrassed myself in front of the most beautiful woman in the quadrant. The crowd reacted again, gasping, murmuring in disbelief at his boldness. Yet Ryan didn't look away. He held her gaze, his smile still there, though more a defense than a joke. Remma's eyes glinted with something dangerous, something ancient. A flicker of approval, or perhaps something darker, passed across her face. Not the first time, Ryan continued, his voice deepening with a dry humor. Probably won't be the last. As the words settled in the air between them, the crowd buzzed again, a ripple of energy that ran through the arena. But Remma, immovable, unfazed, took a step forward. She moved like liquid, fluid, and elegant, but with a strength that left no room for doubt. Her presence was a storm, an unspoken challenge, and Ryan could feel it in his bones. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy as Remma's gaze locked onto Ryan. It was calculating, sharp, each glance felt like a silent judgment. There was no mercy in her eyes, no softness, only a burning fire of expectation. You have made a formal claim, she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence that had fallen over the crowd. Her words echoed through the arena like a thunderclap, sending ripples of anticipation through the onlookers. Ryan's brow furrowed in confusion. A claim to what? His voice, though steady, betrayed the uncertainty in his chest. Remma's lips curled into a slight, enigmatic smile, her eyes glinting with something darker. To me, she replied, her voice low and cold, each word precise as a dagger. To a night of trial with me, and my sisters. The weight of her words hung in the air. Ryan blinked, still processing what she had said, but the atmosphere around them shifted. The crowd, once murmuring with idle curiosity, now buzzed with excitement. The challenge had been made. Remma, in her quiet, unassuming way, had called him out. Ryan stood still, uncertain, trying to gather his bearings. What did this claim mean? What was she asking of him? His eyes wandered across the faces in the crowd, but they were no help. They were all watching him now, waiting. His moment had arrived. He had been chosen for something. Something unknown. You see, Remma continued, her voice dripping with amusement, your sisters think you're too weak for us. She let the words settle like a heavy fog, the meaning clear and cutting. Perhaps they are right. Ryan felt something stir in his chest at her words. Pride, perhaps. Or maybe it was the ghost of the warrior he used to be, the one who had sliced through enemies without a second thought. The one who had held his ground against insurmountable odds. He straightened, squaring his shoulders as best as he could, despite the aching in his body. With respect, Lady Archiner, he replied, his voice firm now, like a battle-worn soldier finding his resolve. Your sisters don't know me? Remma raised an eyebrow at his words, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. She was testing him, probing him, as though searching for cracks in his resolve. She could see that he was damaged, that his body no longer moved with the same grace as it once had, but she saw something more in him. Something deeper. Is that a formal acceptance of the claim? She asked, her voice dripping with challenge. Her question hung between them like a taut rope, waiting to snap. The crowd was silent now, as though holding its breath. Every pair of eyes in the arena was fixed on Ryan, and he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. His heart raced as he thought about his next move. The path ahead was unclear, full of potential pain and humiliation, but there was something stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. The warrior, the bone breaker, was not dead. Not yet. Ryan's lips parted as he met her gaze. There was no going back now. He wasn't sure if he was making a mistake, but in that moment, he didn't care. He would prove her wrong. Prove them all wrong. "I accept," he said, his voice steady, the words slipping out before he could even think about the consequences. The crowd erupted in response. Shocked gasps, followed by a wild frenzy of chatter and speculation. The arena seemed to shake with the energy of their excitement. Remma's eyes narrowed, but her smile widened ever so slightly. She was satisfied, but only just. "So be it," she said, her tone final. "The trial begins now." Ryan stood frozen, his mind racing through the consequences of his decision. The weight of his body, broken by years of battles and pain, pressed heavily on him. His once proud limbs, now sluggish and uncoordinated, begged him to reconsider. He was no longer the warrior he once was. He could feel the scars, both physical and mental, that had accumulated over the years. But then, those eyes, those electric blue eyes, pierced through the fog of doubt. Remma's gaze held him captive, not just seeing his physical frailty but also the remnants of a spirit that had once known nothing but victory. Her eyes burned with the intensity of 1,000 stars, challenging him on a level far deeper than his damaged body could comprehend. They saw beyond his brokenness. They saw potential. They saw strength. Ryan swallowed hard, the weight of her gaze and the significance of the trial settling into his bones. He was no longer fighting just for survival, for food, or even for a meal. He was fighting to prove something, to prove that even in his diminished state, he still had the heart of a warrior. "I accept," he said, the words escaping his lips before his mind could even process them fully. They were a declaration, a promise to himself more than to anyone else. The arena exploded into chaos. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, now erupted in a frenzy of excitement. Shouts filled the air, echoing through the massive structure as if the very walls could feel the excitement vibrating within them. The decision was made. Ryan had accepted the challenge. Bets were already flying through the air, some with a quiet hope that the once feared bone breaker could somehow reclaim his lost glory, while others scoffed, certain that the Archiner sisters would break him without even breaking a sweat. The energy in the arena shifted, a mix of excitement, fear, and anticipation hanging like thick smoke in the air. Would Ryan survive? Could the broken warrior who had once slaughtered hundreds of enemies stand his ground against the Archiner sisters, three of the most dangerous and skilled warriors in the sector? The crowd wasn't sure. Some saw him as a legend past his prime, too slow, too damaged. Others, however, remembered the stories of the bone breaker who had slain entire battalions in a single night, the hero who had fought wars alone. Remma's lips quirked into a smile, her gaze never leaving Ryan. She had issued the challenge, and now it was his turn to prove himself. She knew he was broken, but there was something in the way he accepted, something in the fire still smoldering behind his eyes, that made her curious enough to watch, to wait, to see what he would do next. Ryan's legs felt heavy as he was escorted through the towering entrance of the Violet Towers, a structure so vast it seemed to pierce the sky itself. The air was cooler inside, a contrast to the blistering heat of the arena, but it did nothing to ease the growing tension in his chest. The journey to this moment had been inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. The doors to the inner sanctum opened, and Ryan was led into a dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with intricate carvings that seemed to whisper of ancient rituals and long-forgotten power. The scent of incense lingered in the air, thick and earthy, mingling with the sharp metallic tang of the place. Before him stood Remma's sisters, the Archiner sisters, each one more formidable than the last. Vaya, the middle sister, stood with an air of quiet authority. Her silver eyes fixed on Ryan like a hawk surveying its prey. Her posture was flawless, elegant, but there was something unnerving about her gaze. She didn't just look at him, she measured him, dissecting him piece by piece, as if she could see into the very marrow of his bones. Her fingers grazed the edges of the scrolls she held, and with every movement, Ryan could feel her intelligence pressing down on him like an unseen weight. Nira, the youngest, stood slightly apart, her expression one of detached boredom. She twirled her dark hair between her fingers, sparks of electricity crackling from her fingertips with each absent-minded twist. Her gaze flicked over Ryan's body, but there was no challenge in it, no hunger, only an overwhelming sense of disinterest, as if she found him unworthy of her attention. It was a strange contrast to the other two sisters, whose eyes were locked on him with intensity. Ryan stood tall, despite the fatigue in his muscles and the dull ache in his bones. He had fought wars, but this felt different. He felt exposed. His body, once a well-oiled machine, was now a patchwork of scars, burns, and the remnants of 100 battles. The neural damage from his storm had left him weaker, slower, his reflexes not what they used to be. His exosuit, battered and torn, clung to him like a ghost of his former self, a reminder of the warrior he used to be. Vaya's silver eyes flickered over his body, pausing at each scar, each imperfection. It was as if she could see beyond the skin, into the very heart of what made him. "Your exosuit," she said, her voice low, cold, and calculating, even damaged, "tells a story." Ryan glanced down at the torn remnants of his exosuit. The once pristine armor, now stained with the marks of countless battles, felt foreign to him. "That's the story of a man who's been broken," he replied, bitterness creeping into his voice. The words slipped out before he could stop them, a reminder of everything he had lost, the man he used to be. Remma's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. She stood at the edge of the chamber, her presence as imposing as ever. Her eyes, electric blue, met Ryan's with a challenge that could burn through steel. "The first trial is the ritual of purification," she said, her tone unyielding. "Your body will be examined for worthiness." The words rang in the air like a bell tolling at the start of a ceremony, final, absolute. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the meaning of her words settled into him. Worthiness. What did that even mean? What could they possibly see in his broken body that would make him worthy? Vaya stepped forward first, her movements calculated and precise. She circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her eyes never left his, cold and analytical, as she examined every scar, every muscle, every imperfection. Her fingers schemed the surface of his skin with a cool touch, tracing the jagged line of a wound that had once nearly torn him apart. "Voidwalker blade," she murmured, as though naming an ancient artifact. "5th generation. How did you survive that?" Her voice was clinical, yet there was a hint of something else, respect, maybe. Or curiosity. Ryan didn't answer immediately. The memory of that battle, the terror, the chaos flashed behind his eyes, but he shut it out. "I don't have a soul to sever," he muttered, his voice thick with dry humor, a defense against the rawness of the memories. Vaya's silver eyes flashed with something like approval, but she said nothing more. She continued her inspection, but there was a new air about her now, a subtle shift. Perhaps it was the realization that, despite his brokenness, Ryan was still here. Still standing. Nira, still bored, moved closer, her electricity crackling, lazily arcing from one hand to the next. She ran her fingers over the faint scars on his back, and Ryan winced as a shock of energy hit him, sending a jolt through his body. "Neural dampening rounds," she said, her voice almost bored as she traced the small, circular scars. "Military grade. I didn't think anyone survived those." Ryan gritted his teeth but didn't flinch. "Depends on your definition of enemy," he replied, his words coming out in a low growl. The memories of the battles of the men he had fought and lost rippled across him like ghosts. Remma stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Ryan's with a gaze that felt like a pulse in the air. She was still, but in her stillness, there was a power. A weight. The ritual of purification, she repeated, her voice softer now, but no less commanding. Your worth will be determined by what remains. Not by the scars you wear, but by what your body has become. Ryan's heart thudded against his chest. His body. Was that what this was really about? Was he worth more than the damage he'd suffered? Could he still be the man he once was, despite everything that had been broken? The room was silent for a long moment, save for the occasional spark of electricity from Nira. Ryan stood tall, his breath steadying, the weight of his past battles pressing down on him but not crushing him. He had survived the worst. Now, he had to prove that survival meant something. That he was worth the trials. Let the purification begin, Remma said, her voice a quiet command that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. The air in the chamber was thick with anticipation, the echoes of the purification still lingering as Ryan stood before the feast laid out for him. It wasn't just a meal, it was a test, a trial of more than just physical endurance. The food before him pulsed with an unnatural light, each dish flickering like it held secrets within its depths, secrets meant only for the worthy. Strange forms, translucent and shifting, hummed with faint vibrations, almost as though they were alive, whispering their own voices in a language Ryan couldn't understand. Via stood beside him, her silver eyes gleaming with that same calculating intensity. These dishes are not merely for sustenance, she said, her voice cool and measured. They reveal your nature. What you choose, and how you consume it, will show us who you truly are. Ryan's gaze swept over the array of food laid out before him. The scents were strange and foreign, tantalizing yet unsettling. He could sense the weight of the ritual in each dish, the way it seemed to beckon, to pull at him in a way no ordinary meal ever could. His stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that gripped him now. It was the sharp sting of awareness. This was no ordinary test. This was a moment that would define him, one way or another. With a steady hand, he reached for a bowl of shimmering stew that seemed to ripple with a strange, otherworldly glow. The liquid inside shimmered like liquid mercury, swirling in colors he couldn't quite name. His fingers brushed the edge of the bowl, and the moment it touched his lips, everything shifted. The warmth of the broth turned to coldness, and Ryan's senses were immediately assaulted. The stew in his mouth transformed, thickening, darkening, and turning to a viscous black sludge that coated his tongue with a bitter, rancid taste. His throat tightened, but he swallowed anyway, the liquid moving down like lead. As the broth slid down his throat, memories rushed at him, sharp, jagged pieces of his past. He could taste betrayal. The kind that burned through his bones. The kind that left a bitter, aching emptiness in its wake. The blackness of the stew morphed into something deeper, darker, like the aftermath of a neural cannon strike that had nearly torn him apart. The flash of bright, searing pain, the twisting of his body as the energy surged through him, leaving him broken and alone on the battlefield. Ryan's breath hitched. His body, still scarred from that night, responded with an involuntary shudder. I tasted betrayal, Ryan muttered, his voice low and strained as he set the bowl back down. His hands were trembling, his fingers slick with the remnants of the strange broth. It tastes like ash, and regret. The silence that followed his words was thick, suffocating, until Nira's voice sliced through it, sharp and mocking. Guess you're not as tough as they say, bone breaker? Her smirk was playful, but there was a flicker of something darker behind her eyes. Her electricity crackled in the air, dancing between her fingers with a restless energy that mirrored her amusement. Ryan didn't look up at her. He kept his gaze on the empty bowl, the taste of the stew still lingering in the back of his throat. She had been right about one thing: this trial was about more than just physical endurance. It was a test of who he was, deep down, where the wounds of the past lay hidden beneath the surface. What had he chosen? And what did it say about him? His mind flashed to the battles he'd fought, faced with enemies, faced with himself. Betrayal had followed him like a shadow, and the regret, it was a constant companion. The meal was not meant to nourish him. It was meant to expose him. Ryan swallowed hard, clearing his throat. He forced his hands to stop trembling, to push aside the memories that threatened to drag him back into the darkness. "I'm not broken," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Not yet." Via's eyes glinted with quiet approval. She had been watching, carefully, analyzing his reaction. "Your nature has been revealed, Bone Breaker," she said, her voice soft but piercing, like a blade just below the skin. "And now we know who you really are?" Nira's smirk remained, though there was something almost approving in it now. "You're not as weak as you look," she said, her tone shifting just a little, as though she were impressed. "You might survive this after all." Ryan's gaze lifted to meet Remma's, standing quietly by the side. She said nothing, but her blue eyes flickered with something unreadable. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was something else. Whatever it was, it wasn't pity. And that, more than anything, told him he wasn't finished yet. The feast trial was over, but the true test had only just begun. The chamber was still, the air heavy with anticipation, as Ryan stood at the center of the vast, crystal-like floor. The three Archiner sisters circled him, their movements as fluid as water, their grace a deadly dance. Each step they took was in perfect synchrony, a seamless blend of power and beauty that should have overwhelmed any warrior's senses. Yet, as they danced around him, their bodies swaying like ethereal figures in the dim light, Ryan remained still, his breath slow, steady, measured. It was not the pain in his body that held him captive, nor the tremors in his muscles. His damaged body, weakened by the neural storm, had already endured far worse. His movements were now stilted and heavy, his senses dulled by the after effects of the injury. But it wasn't his body the sisters were attacking. It was his mind. The sisters had been instructed to test his willpower to break him, not with strength, but with influence. Their movements were designed to disorient, to manipulate, to cloud his thoughts. With each step they took, Ryan could feel their energy swirling around him, like invisible tendrils of suggestion, slipping into his mind, whispering with hypnotic rhythm. Their dance was a mesmerizing assault on his senses, their voices like music woven with subtle commands. But Ryan's broken mind, tangled and frayed though it was, held one advantage. The damage to his neural pathways, once thought to be a weakness, now provided a strange shield. The manipulations they tried to impose, the soft whispers of temptation, couldn't reach him in the way they intended. His mind, already fragmented and scattered, resisted them like water slipping through the cracks in a dam. The sisters' subtle power, designed to overwhelm and break, met resistance. His fragmented mind acted as a barrier, an unpredictable, uncontrollable force that refused to bend to their will. For hours, they danced around him, their movements growing more intense, more insistent. Via's steps were measured and deliberate, her silver eyes never leaving his face, calculating each response, each flicker of resistance. Nira moved with a teasing energy, her movements playful and challenging, each subtle touch of her fingers sending electric currents through the air, trying to spark a reaction from him. Remma, however, was the center of it all. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, like the pull of gravity itself, drawing him into a space where the laws of nature seemed to bend. Her electric blue eyes burned into him, filled with a challenge that went deeper than just physical combat. She wanted to see if he had the will to resist. Wanted to test whether the broken warrior still had the spirit to endure. Ryan's body trembled, exhaustion creeping in. His damaged legs shook with the effort of holding his ground, but his mind stayed sharp. He could feel the sisters' influence like shadows moving in the corners of his vision, like whispers at the edges of his consciousness, but they could not break him. Not yet. He gritted his teeth, his breath shallow, but he refused to fall. The challenge was more than physical. It was a test of spirit. Of will. A test to see if the warrior he had once been, broken as he was, could rise from the ashes of his former self. The dance continued, the three sisters circling him with ever-increasing speed, their bodies flowing like water, relentless in their pursuit of his mind. The air was thick with energy, with the weight of their expectations, but Ryan's resolve held firm. He was more than his injuries. More than his past. His vision blurred slightly, the pain in his body flaring up, but he fought through it. His breathing became more controlled, more focused. Each breath a small victory. The final moon, the violet one, hung low in the sky, its light bathing the chamber in an eerie glow. As the moon reached its lowest point, the sisters slowed their movements, their dance coming to an inevitable stop. The music that had filled the air faded, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Ryan stood tall, his body shaking, his muscles straining with the weight of the trial, but he did not collapse. He remained standing, unwavering. Remma's voice broke the silence, soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "You've passed," she said, her tone calm and respectful, a stark contrast to the storm of power that had raged around him moments before. Ryan's heart thundered in his chest, a mixture of relief and triumph flooding through him. He had done it. He had resisted their influence. He had stood firm against the storm of their power. As the sisters stepped back, their expressions unreadable, Ryan felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He had passed the trial not by brute force, but by sheer willpower, by the strength of his spirit. For the first time in a long time, Ryan Cavano felt a flicker of the warrior he once was. And it felt like fire. Ryan's chest was still heavy with the weight of the final trial. His body ached, trembling with exhaustion, but the fire within him, the same fire that had made him bone breaker, was reigniting, slowly but surely. As he stood there, his breath steadying, he felt a spark of triumph deep within. He had endured. He had resisted. But just as he thought the trials were behind him, just as he believed he had earned his hard-won victory, a new challenge emerged. A deep, unsettling rumble reverberated through the violet towers, rattling the air around them. The walls seemed to groan, the floor beneath his boots vibrating with an unnatural force. From the distance, a high-pitched screech echoed through the city, sharp and discordant. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that sound. The swarm. It had been contained for centuries, locked away beneath Zantara's 7 in massive, bio-sealed biodomes. A hive consciousness, mindless, but endlessly hungry, devouring everything in its path, converting its victims into more of its own kind. The threat of the swarm had always loomed, but never before had it breached containment. And now, it was here. The ground shook again, this time with greater intensity. The air turned thick with a metallic scent of something wrong, something unnatural. Ryan's breath quickened, and he didn't need to look to know the sisters felt it too. They all felt it, the danger, the rising storm of chaos. Remma's voice, usually calm and measured, now had a sharp edge of urgency. "We need to move. Now." Ryan nodded without a word, his instincts already kicking into overdrive. His body was battered, his muscles still raw from the trials, but there was no time for weakness now. His purpose had been reignited, and the hunger for battle, a hunger he thought had died, roared to life again. The 3 sisters, their faces set with determination, fell into formation with him. Via's silver eyes glinted with cold precision, Nira crackled with raw energy, and Rem remained the unyielding pillar of calm. Together, they ran toward the heart of the city, where the swarm had begun its deadly advance. As they approached the central plaza, the sight that met them froze Ryan's blood. The swarm had already begun to spill into the streets, an unstoppable tide of chittering, biomechanical creatures. Their bodies shimmered like twisted metal, each one part living organism, part machine, linked together in a hive mind that thrived on chaos. They moved like a single entity, an army of mindless soldiers marching in perfect synchrony. Ryan didn't hesitate. His hand instinctively gripped the hilt of his weapon, the Star Divider, a relic of ancient technology. The blade pulsed in his hand, its energy thrumming with a life of its own, responding to the warrior who had once wielded it with terrifying precision. With a battle cry that echoed across the plaza, Ryan charged. The swarm moved toward him, a wave of gleaming insectoid creatures, their eyes cold and empty, their movements fast and relentless. Ryan swung the Star Divider with deadly force. The blade tore through the first wave of creatures like fire through paper, each slash igniting the air with blue flames, each strike obliterating the twisted bodies in its path. The sound of metal and flesh being torn apart echoed through the plaza, a symphony of destruction. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days, the days when he had been invincible, when the weight of his reputation had been enough to send enemies scattering in fear. The Star Divider burned with a furious heat as it sliced through the horde, each swing a reminder of what he used to be, a force of nature, a destroyer. But the swarm didn't relent. It pressed forward, undeterred, an endless sea of writhing bodies. They moved in waves, flooding the streets and climbing over each other like insects crawling over the earth. Ryan's breath quickened, but the fire inside him remained. His once broken body, still ravaged by the neural storm, now moved with a renewed purpose. The aches and pains seemed to melt away as he focused on the fight. Each cut, each swing, each strike was fueled by something deeper than the physical, something primal. His mind, once shattered, now felt sharp again, alive with the rush of battle. He charged into the heart of the swarm, his movements a blur of blue flame. The creatures, sensing his strength, surged toward him, their claws and mandibles snapping in the air. But Ryan was unstoppable. With each blow of his blade, he cut through their ranks, his muscles and reflexes, though still damaged, reacting with a deadly precision. The Star Divider hummed with power, each strike more powerful than the last. He wasn't fighting just for survival anymore. He was fighting for the memory of who he had once been. For the warrior inside him that refused to die, no matter how broken the body. But the swarm was relentless. They adapted quickly, learning from every move. As Ryan cleaved through one wave, another emerged, more aggressive, more deadly. The weight of the battle began to press in on him, but his focus never wavered. Then, through the chaos, Ryan spotted a massive creature, twice the size of the others, its body covered in glistening metal plating. The Queen Node. It moved toward him with a purpose, its mindless swarm parting to make way for the creature at the center of it all. The Queen Node was the source, the heart of the hive, the one that controlled them all. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The final push. Without hesitation, he lunged toward the Queen Node, the Star Divider raised high. The blade cut through the creatures that stood in his way, but they were fast, relentless, and they were closing in around him. Just as the Queen Node's massive form loomed above him, it let out a shrill, high-pitched scream, sending shockwaves through the plaza. The creatures around Ryan reacted instantly, charging at him in a frenzied wave. With a roar, Ryan swung the Star Divider, the blade igniting with a flash of blue fire as it cleaved through the heart of the swarm. His movements were sharp, desperate, but his resolve was iron. He struck the Queen Node with one final blow, his muscles screaming in protest as the blade cut deep into the creature's core. The entire plaza seemed to shudder as the Queen Node let out a final, agonized screech, its body cracking open like a shell, sending a pulse of energy through the horde. For a moment, everything stopped. The swarm froze, their bodies slumping to the ground as the energy from their queen dissipated. The creatures fell lifeless, their minds severed from the collective consciousness. Ryan stood, panting, his body covered in the itch of the swarm. His heart thundered in his chest, but he was alive. He had done it. He had reclaimed his place as the bone breaker. The battlefield was silent now, save for the soft hiss of the last few creatures crumbling into the dust. The plaza, once chaotic and alive with the horrors of the swarm, was now still. The air felt charged, heavy with the aftermath of the battle, a quiet that could only come after the storm had passed. Ryan stood among the fallen, his breath ragged, his body bruised and battered, but he was standing. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he had thought he'd lost forever: strength. Real strength. Not the kind that came from physical power or the name Bone Breaker that had once struck terror into enemies, but a deeper, more vital strength. The strength of a man who had fought not just to survive, but to reclaim something far more important than that: purpose. He turned, his gaze falling on Remma. She had been with him every step of the way, watching silently, yet guiding him with her presence. Her emerald skin glowed softly under the pale light of the now-set moons, the faintest shimmer reflecting the faint stars in the sky. There was a subtle shift in her expression now, a tenderness he had not expected. "You were never gone," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, filled with an emotion that spoke to the depths of her understanding. Just waiting. The words landed like a breath of fresh air in his chest. The weight of the years, the trials, the battles, seemed to lift for a moment. He realized, in that quiet moment, that she had seen him not just as the bone breaker of legend, but as a man who had been lost, who had fought not for victory, but to find a reason to fight again. Ryan's heart throbbed in his chest. He had been waiting for something, for someone, to remind him that he wasn't done yet, that his fight, his life, wasn't just about surviving, about walking through each day empty and broken. His eyes softened as he met Remma's gaze. The weight of the moment, the weight of everything he had been through, felt lighter in her presence. She had given him something he had lost, something he hadn't even realized he was looking for: hope. The stars stretched out before them, a vast sea of light that seemed to whisper of endless possibilities, of futures not yet written. Ryan stood beside Remma, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. In that moment, standing there, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, Ryan realized that he had found something worth fighting for once again. Something more than just survival. He had found a reason to live, a reason to keep moving forward. And, for the first time in years, he didn't feel broken. He felt whole. As the night sky stretched above them, vast and unending, Ryan allowed himself to smile, a rare, genuine smile. It wasn't the smile of a bone breaker. It was the smile of a man who had rediscovered his purpose, who had found a new path to walk, not alone, but with someone who understood him. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape now. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready. One cycle had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. Ryan stood beside Remma, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, their fingers entwined. The weight of their shared journey, the trials, and the battles had forged something far more powerful than they had ever anticipated, a bond not just of love, but of unity. Remma, now consort prime, stood with a quiet dignity beside him, her presence commanding respect in the chambers of Zantara 7. She was a leader, not only of the people of Zantara 7 but of the Archiner bloodline itself. Her emerald skin shimmered beneath the light of the twin suns, her eyes holding the depth of 1,000 stars. She had always been more than just a fierce warrior. She was a leader, a ruler, and now, as the bonds between them solidified, she was also his equal, his partner in a way neither had ever imagined. Ryan's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time in a long while, there was no bitterness or loss in his heart. There was peace. A calm that had taken years to find, but now, standing here beside Remma, with the future unfolding before them, he understood the meaning of it. Together, they had built something strong, something that neither of them had dared to dream of before. A future solid, unyielding, and filled with hope. The scars that once marred Ryan's body, both physical and emotional, had faded into something less defining. His past no longer held him prisoner, it had become part of his story, a story he now shared with Remma and the sisters who had tested him, pushed him beyond his limits, and ultimately, accepted him for the man he was. They had fought together, side by side, through battles and challenges that had tested every ounce of their strength. And in the process, they had become something more than just lovers, more than just partners in war. They had become a family. Ryan's eyes drifted across the horizon, where the twin moons of Zantara 7 hung low, casting a soft, pale glow over the land. The future stretched out before him, a vast expanse of possibility, full of unknowns but no longer filled with fear. Whatever came next, whatever challenges loomed on the horizon, Ryan knew that he wasn't facing them alone. Remma was by his side, the sisters at his back, and together, they would face whatever the universe threw at them. The next challenge, whatever it may be, could not break them. Not now. Not when they had learned the true strength of what it meant to fight for each other, to fight for something greater than just survival. Together, they were unstoppable. And as the stars above them shone brightly in the endless sky, Ryan couldn't help but smile. He had found what he had been searching for all along. A family, a purpose, and a love that could withstand anything. The future was theirs, and for the first time in years, Ryan felt ready to face it with open arms. He was broken. Forgotten. A relic from a war no one wanted to remember. But when the universe pushed him to the edge, he pushed back. Ryan Cavano, once a legend, faced the impossible. 3 alien warrior sisters, a forgotten blood rite, and a planet on the brink of extinction. He didn't just survive the trials. He defied them. He rekindled his purpose. And in doing so, he rewrote his destiny. What began with a stumble in the sand ended with him standing tall, stronger, smarter, and more human than ever. He became more than just a bone breaker. He became family. He became a symbol. He became hope. But legends don't rest. Out there, in the darkness between stars, new threats awaken. Old enemies remember. And the children of Zantara will soon face trials of their own. The war is over. But the future is just beginning. This was only the first chapter. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles. Because the galaxy hasn't heard the last of Ryan Cavano. And neither have you.